Okay, just put this on. So thank you so much for joining me today for this webinar on measuring the prevalence of parental alienating behaviours in a representative UK sample. My aim today is to share the findings of 2 reports that are available from today on the UWL website and that are currently being translated into academic papers. One is about to be published and the other is currently under review in highly respected journals, and they will be made available, and I will make sure that delegates and attendees on this call know about those when they're available, to demonstrate the robustness of this evidence. Well, my aim today is to present those reports, to have a dialogue with key stakeholders on this call, to discuss the findings, and also to kind of leave attendees with a clear positioning on the issue as well, and of course online viewers who see this after the event itself. So just very quickly, I know a lot of you on the call do know me, but for those of you who don't, my name is Ben Hine and I'm Professor of Applied Psychology at the University of West London. I'm one of the UK's leading academics and authors on parental alienation. I have a published book that is out at the moment on Amazon called Parental Alienation, a contemporary guide for parents, practitioners and policymakers. And I've also signed a contract with Routledge to produce another book on PA, which is going to be called Parental Alienation, Theoretical Insights and Practical Solutions, which is going to be released in spring 2026, which I'm working on at the moment. And a lot of the academic work that I've done in this area has been informed by my lived experience of parental alienation and alienating behaviours as a child, which has positioned me very effectively as a researcher to empathise and to draw out data and information from others who have lived experience and to present those in an accessible way to the public and policymakers. The first thing I want to start off with is just to position the issue for those who are not aware. A lot of people on the call may have seen parts of this presentation before. They may also already have my book. So apologies if this is repetitive, but in light of the upcoming book by the Parental Alienation Study Group, of which I am a part, which is going to be providing a definitive brief synopsis of the issue, I think it's really important just to provide the most up-to-date evidence to situate the findings that I'm going to present today. And this is all from a narrative review that I wrote and had published in the journal Partner Reviews last year. And the background to providing that review was that there is rising interest in the issue and research around it, but there are also many challenges as well. There's a great complexity around these behaviours, as there is any form of abuse and violence, and parental alienation specifically has quite a controversial origin, and there's lots of discussion around the terminology and the name, etc. So the review set out to basically delineate between what we know and what we don't know, so the illegitimate and then the legitimate areas of contention and argument. And so because there is debate and controversy, again, some of it is unfounded and some of it is founded, and that's what that review sought to do, is to disentangle illegitimate controversy, i.e. what we already know, from legitimate controversy, that should say legitimate, apologies, which is what we don't know. So allow us to get into that now very briefly. What do we know? Well, there has been a lot of discussion about defining parental alienation, and in many documents, including recent policy documents, there has been the phrase used, no official definition of parental alienation and alienating behaviours exists. That is false. There is discussion around the definition, as there is for any form of violence, because we have to update our definitions with our understanding. But to state that there is no definition is false, and it's important that we make it clear on this call and to those that we speak to that there is a very clear definition of parental alienation and alienating behaviours that have evolved over time. All of the definitions revolve around the idea that alienation involves a form of contact refusal that is due to the behavior of one parent towards the child to disrupt the relationship between that child and the other parent. Now, yes, there are different ways of explaining that, and there are slightly different language used by different researchers. But the argument that there is no definition is a little bit of a kind of red herring to draw people away from the issue, where and I think sometimes it's used duplicitously because we do have definitions, and that is not to undermine the importance of having clear definitions, because it's really important to have high consensus on what a concept means. And there have been numerous studies that have explored that and have demonstrated that actually practitioners, for example, custody evaluators, do have a clear idea of what it means. And it was also important for us as an academic group to make sure that we're very clear. And one of the things we've been through recently is being clear that there is a process and there is an outcome. So the process is talking about the behaviors themselves. And that's why we now use the term PABs or ABs for parental alienating behaviors or alienating behaviors to talk about what's being done. And we now use parental alienation to talk about the outcome. So that's when the contact refusal is manifesting as a result of those behaviors. And so we are able to now measure parental alienation because we have a robust understanding of what it is and what it looks like. So we have a process where behaviors are being enacted, and we'll have a look at some of those behaviors in a minute. And then we have an outcome, which is when contact refusal is manifesting as a result of those behaviors. And this has allowed, for example, the development of lots of different measures. So the RPAS, the PARQ. Jennifer Harmon and colleagues has just produced another highly validated 30-item scale to measure alienating behaviors, which is actually what we used in the second study I'm going to present today, which shows that it is actually possible to reliably measure the behaviors, and it is also possible to measure the outcome of parental alienation as well, using William Burnett's 5-factor model as a starting point. There is a lot of discussion, and I know there are certain clinicians on the call who will talk in much more detail about the kind of clinical assessments that you can do. And again, there is discussion there around how far, for example, just looking at the behavior gets you. However, the 5-factor model is a really, really good framework to at least start from to identify the contextual factors around those behaviors. So in the 5-factor model, there have to be numerous factors present. So factor 1 is that the child has to manifest some kind of contact resistance or refusal. So that's your starting point. Is a child refusing contact or is reluctant to engage in a relationship with one parent? You then go to the next factor, which was there a positive prior relationship between the child and the rejected parent? The third factor is, was there an absence of abuse, neglect, or seriously deficient parenting on the part of the rejected parent? And the reason why factor 2 and factor 3 are so important is because if, for example, the child has never had a positive relationship with the rejected parent, or if the rejected parent is abusive, neglectful, or seriously deficient in their parenting, there may be a justified reason, and we'll come on to this in a second, why the child is refusing contact. Now, again, some of my academic colleagues on the call and in written prose have argued that even this is complicated because children still show a natural desire and affinity to bond with parents, even if they are abusive. So it's actually difficult to tell whether the contact refusal is a manifestation of that or not. But this does help in narrowing down at least situations where you had a child, they had a perfectly fine or positive relationship with the parent, and then all of a sudden the child is manifesting contact refusal, because that would suggest that something strange is happening, i.e. potentially factor 4, which is the presence of the alienating behaviours. And when we talk about what those alienating behaviours are, again, some of the arguments that have been, I think, erroneously presented against this is that, well, anything could count as parental alienation. That's not the case. There's been a lot of work, and it's taken time, as these things do, to think about what those core alienating behaviours might look like. And these are the 17 that are proposed by the 5-factor model. And importantly, some of these behaviours are not alienating depending on the context. So if the other factors aren't present, some of these behaviours may well be protective. So it's really important that we don't look at anything in isolation. When you're looking at alienating behaviours, okay, why are they occurring? What context are they occurring within? And these are some of the examples. So bad mouthing a rejected parent, telling a child the rejected parent doesn't love them, etc. So some of these are very clearly alienating. Some of them could be considered protective depending on the circumstance. And then the final factor in the 5-factor model is really around establishing then the impact. So has alienation actually occurred as shown by the manifestation within the child? So does the child, for example, exhibit any of these common manifestations as a result? So joining in with the campaign of denigration, a lack of ambivalence towards the favoured and rejected parent, and the absence of guilt about their rude and hurtful treatment. Now, interestingly, there are still caveats to be made around the 5-factor model, some of which are, for example, just because the child isn't refusing contact, resistance, or refusal, it doesn't mean that alienating behaviours aren't occurring and that they aren't damaging. Because it may well be that that resistance or refusal is building, and there are people who argue that we shouldn't have to wait for the contact, resistance, or the refusal to manifest before tackling the behaviours. Similarly, there are some that argue that whether the child is then exhibiting the behavioural manifestations shouldn't be a red line in terms of determining whether alienation has occurred or whether alienating behaviours are occurring. Again, because the child may still be doing their best to please and to see both parents, despite the fact that the behaviours are happening, and it still might be causing things like psychological splitting and alignment within the child's mind. So there are still discussions that are ongoing around how we apply these factors, when we apply them, and that has a very important impact for things like policy and frameworks, which we'll come on to at the end of the talk, in terms of determining when something can be brought, for example, in a family court hearing. Because if you applied this to another form of domestic violence, for example, you wouldn't necessarily wait to see the impact and manifestation within the child before taking protective measures from an abusive parent in any other setting. So there are lots of still discussions to be had around the 5-factor model and determining whether alienation has occurred. However, the point of this model is to really show that there has to be a consideration of the holistic context in which the behaviours are occurring to understand whether it's alienating behaviours in the first instance, and if it is alienating behaviours, why are they occurring and what the manifestations of those are. And this has prompted a lot of discussion within the community about what we might determine to be legitimate versus illegitimate reasons. Now, those terms are very subjective, and they can be applied, differently by different individuals. But what we are broadly talking about is when you have a child that is rejecting a parent for something that is understandable, and most commonly people would point to if you have an abusive parent, if a parent has been emotionally neglectful or abusive or absent, there might be a justified reason why the child is rejecting contact. Conversely, if the child had previously good relationship and is now rejecting because of those alienating behaviours, then that would be an illegitimate reason. And of course, there are hybrid cases where there may be a mix of both of those going on, which are extremely difficult to evaluate. And that's why it's recognised that the cases are extremely complex to evaluate, challenges in delineating PA from justified estrangement, hence the Family Justice Council guidance that we have just had, which we will talk about again at the end of the presentation. One of the other key developments is that there is a growing consensus within the community that alienating behaviours can be situated as a form of family violence, and others have talked about where exactly it fits, whether it's emotional or psychological abuse, coercive control, whether it's child abuse. All of these arguments coalesce around the similarities between not only the process and the enactment of the abuse, but also the impact on survivors that are very similar to other forms of child abuse and psychological and emotional abuse. And the most important place that we can look for this is when we're talking to targeted parents and children who they themselves describe it as a form of control and emotional abuse. And that's with both mothers and fathers. So that's just a little bit of information about what we do know. And when we say things like that, it's still with that acknowledgement that with any phenomenon in any discipline, not just abuse, but in any part of psychology, there is an ongoing discussion and debate about refining some of those things. But fundamentally, there is a clear definition, there is a strong evidence base, and we know how to measure it, and we have some idea on how to contextualize the behaviors. We also know a little bit about the actors involved, depending on who those are. So gathering information and data from alienating parents is very difficult because often alienating parents may not understand what they are doing is alienating the child, or they may feel justified in their actions. So it's actually quite rare to have someone come forward and say, yes, I know I'm alienating and I'm proud of it and I'm happy to talk about it. So they're quite hard to study. But there's been lots of theoretical work as to why parents might alienate around personality disorder, things like revenge, grief over a relationship, etc. There is also some other research that's slightly more academic and empirical, coding case files, which is Roma's work, looking for evidence of these things within written and verbal testimony, which has kind of provided this evidence base for a whole swathe of reasons why parents alienate. And of course, this is also covered in Craig Childress's work and a number of colleagues on the call's work around how attachment trauma on the part of the parent influences their behavior when their attachment with a child is seen as at risk. So there's lots of largely theoretical work available at the moment as to why parents alienate, and there is slight evidence of gender differences in how parents alienate. In terms of alienated parents, we have a lot more evidence because whilst alienating parents may not know what they're doing or may not be doing it maliciously, targeted parents are very clear on those things and they experience them very viscerally. And there's been a whole lot of work, including my own, Lee Maturana's work. There's been work around the world in Turkey, in Portugal, that has all coalesced around these kind of central findings that there are significant and wide-ranging negative impacts of being an alienated parent. And most extreme of which, as shown in Lee Maturana's work on the next slide, shown in bold, are these feelings of disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss. So this idea that you are grieving something that is technically still present in the physical world, but you don't have access to it. The wide variety of negative emotions that those parents feel, and most importantly, the link between those emotions and suicide ideation, which was also covered in my project from 2022, the Lost Dads project, of which a couple of papers have started to be published, and I posted about those online last week. And arguably most importantly, there has been a lot of, and there is increasing work on the impact of alienating behaviours on children themselves. There is now a significant body of work that demonstrates that alienating behaviour should be recognised as an adverse childhood experience due to the increased lifetime risks of both mental and physical illness for children involved. There have been other smaller qualitative pieces done, like Bahar's work in 22, which did interviews with alienated children and discovered those themes, which I'll allow you to read. And then the Morales review in 2021 really brought all of our existing knowledge together, showing a wide variety of negative outcomes for children that are alienated. And this is where I usually also step in and just talk as a child myself who was alienated from a parent. A lot of these ring very, very true and are lifelong issues to deal with. And just wanted to throw this in as well, because it's a really good paper by Jennifer Harman and colleagues in 2022, talking about parental alienation through the lens of loss. And they talked very clearly about how children not only lose their sense of self and their childhood and innocence, but they also lose a good enough parent, their extended family and a community. And they did this process of mapping how alienation robs children at every level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So that's a really good paper if people want to follow up and have a look at that one. And finally, in that review, I really tried to focus the readers on this slide. And I think it's really important takeaway for this group as well, is that there is a significant body, a critical mass of empirical evidence that supports the phenomenon of alienating behaviours and subsequent alienation itself. Harman did a wonderful and very thoroughly reviewed and published in a highly reputable APA accredited journal review that confirms the scientific status of the PA field. And I think what's important is to make sure that we contrast that to the critiques with oppositional views, because a lot of those are based in the non-psychological sphere. First of all, they often come from law, and there are different arguments there that are being conflated. They often don't center around empirical work, and they're often based on kind of opinion and ideological approach rather than scientific validation. And I think it's really, really important to look at the quality of evidence that's being put forward on both sides, because the academic consensus at the moment, if you read the literature correctly, is that parental alienation and alienating behaviours exist and they are an empirically supportive phenomenon. What we don't know, and what I will agree with, is that we have significant issues, for example, about how alienating behaviours are brought in family court. And we will touch upon this at the end when we look at the FJC guidance. But there is a lot of research, some saying alienation and claims of alienation do not have an impact on outcomes. And that work is done on large-scale case reviews that are robustly conducted. And then there is subsequently another camp of researchers that have done much smaller reviews, looking at selective cases and sometimes just critiques, that are saying alienation does have an impact, which is on less robust research. And it has made researchers divide into these two camps. And the important thing to look at on this slide is that there is, at the moment, a false flag in terms of the genderization of this issue. And what I mean by that is that it's presented at the moment as a very clear-cut issue of women raising claims of domestic violence are having alienation claims by fathers put forward to minimize that violence. And within that statement, there is no acknowledgement that fathers can also be the victims of domestic violence and bring forward those claims, nor there is any acknowledgement that when women bring those claims, they may be false claims. And people don't like to talk about that, but any form of abuse can be brought forward as a false allegation. Nor is there wiggle room on the other side to say, yes, I absolutely accept that fathers bring forward erroneous PA claims, but also mothers and fathers also bring forward legitimate alienation claims. So what's happened is we've got a very limited false dichotomy and argument around what role mothers and fathers play within the family courts, and these arguments that are nowhere near broad enough in terms of their scope. I can just hear a sound in my ear, so if everyone can just make sure that their mics are muted, that's wonderful. And moving forward, we need to address the fact that there isn't enough research available on court case outcomes, particularly in the UK and England and Wales. And there isn't enough overlap between the evidence base and the professionals involved, because we have a very worrying trend at the moment where alienation and the concept and phenomenon of alienation is being shut out of courts, when it's actually a very important behavioral pattern within separation and divorce proceedings that needs to have a space within court. And that comes from a lack of understanding and a lack of kind of holistic family assessment that occurs in court. The other area of contention, which I won't touch upon too long because it could be a whole presentation in itself, is around how we then intervene and treat the phenomenon. And there is a lot of evidence around supporting interventions, but also a lot of valid critique and questioning, and I want to say suspicion, but that sounds too emotive, you know, critical inquiry about the effectiveness of those interventions and the risks that come with them, as has been articulated by authors like Mercer and Train and Adrian Barnett, etc. So what I want to do is now move us on to arguably what is the main event of this talk, which is to look at, okay, if we strip back all of that and we accept, as we should, based on a reading of the literature, that this is a phenomenon that exists and it's serious, we need to know how serious. We need to place what I would conceptualize as the foundational building brick to building up to a sensible approach to this argument. And the first brick is, how much is it occurring? So I was very, very lucky to receive a small amount of funding from the Sir Halley Stewart Trust and also a CIC called Good Egg Safety. Jan Dennis, who's involved in that, is on the call, and I'm really grateful that she's here and that we were awarded that money to conduct 2 robust studies into the prevalence of PABs in the UK. And the reason we wanted to do that was because prevalence research, it is in its infancy, but there were some results that have come out of the US and Canada over the last kind of 8 or so years that have demonstrated that actually it is a widespread phenomenon, that between 13 and 39% of parents say they have experienced alienating behaviours, with 6% of those reporting moderate to severe alienation from their children. So the manifestation of those behaviours. And my argument to the funders, which they thankfully believed, was that if this was replicated in the UK, this would equate to millions and millions of adults and children every year, based on our statistics of who is separating and who is divorcing and how many families are involved, that would be experiencing this phenomenon. So the first study was funded by the Sir Halley Stewart Trust, and it was with separated or divorced adults. And so what we did is we got a cross-sectional survey of 1,005 divorced or separated UK residents. And what happened was the panel, it was Atomic Research, they're a market research company, they reached out to a 10,000 strong pool of representative UK residents and filtered through 1,005 of those that were separated or divorced to, as best as possible, capture the representative natural fallout of the separated and divorced sample within a proportionately representative UK sample. And we then asked those participants to self-report their experiencing of alienating behaviours through 2 sets of questions. So the first was, have you been alienated? Have you experienced these behaviours? So it's very straightforward, using the descriptors that we're familiar with in the literature. The second way that we did it was through a more veiled series of questions. So these were items of a validated scale that asked about the behaviours without mentioning that terminology. And the final thing that we also did is that we asked parents the other contextual factors as well. We asked them, did you have a previous good relationship? Has contact ceased, etc.? And we also used established measures of violence, like the conflict tactics scale. We used a legal and administrative abuse scale, which is a scale measuring when individuals use legal systems in order to enact their abuse. And we use mental health measures, including PTSD, depression, and suicidality measures. And here is what we found. And these are extremely important findings. So when we asked participants outright, have you been alienated from your child? Have you experienced parental alienating behaviours? Similar to Harmon, around 39% said, yes, I have. Now, the issue with that is that you're using terminology that some parents might not be familiar with. And so we then looked at how many percentage of them said, yes, they had experienced the PABs, and this was a yes or no question, and 60% said that they had experienced at least one of those behaviours on the scale. The final thing that we then did is that we took parents and we matched up their scores, because we asked about the behaviours they'd received and the behaviours they'd enacted. And we came up with a cutoff to say, okay, if you have enacted any of these behaviours and also received them, then you're reciprocal, you're reciprocating those behaviours. But we also came up with groups where we said, okay, if you haven't done any alienating behaviours yourselves, but you've received them, then you're what we call a non-reciprocal targeted parent. And that came out about 36.5%. So all of these are hugely decent percentages to demonstrate that out of our representative sample, if we take the lowest one, 36.5% was saying, I've never done anything to alienate my children, but I've experienced alienating behaviours. So that's just above a third of the sample. And it's important that we then extrapolate those percentages, because in the UK every year there are around 100,000 individuals that get divorced. So, you know, 40% nearly of those, or 36% of those, you know, is 36,500 individuals every year that may be experiencing these behaviours. And that's just using the divorce numbers. So if we added in separation and other kind of forms of family breakdown, it'd be much higher. So this is a hugely prevalent phenomenon. And it's not just those who are also committing those behaviours, it's those who are just receiving them. And a really critical finding was there was no significant differences in PAB experiences across demographic groups. The most important one to highlight there is gender. So both separated mothers and fathers reported alienating behaviours to the same level. So there was no differences there. It's often framed as either a male or a female issue. And I have spoken with individuals who get a lot of horrible, nasty comments online, talking about things in a very gendered way, talking to them in a horrible way, making it a gendered issue when it is not. Anyone is capable of alienating a child. Then when we look at the relationship between the alienating behaviours and other phenomenon, we see that there's a strong correlation between those alienating behaviours and mental health outcomes such as PTSD, depression, and suicide ideation. We can't know the causality of that relationship, so we don't know whether the PABs cause those conditions or vice versa, but they are related, and that is enough, to cause concern. Finally, there was links between the PABs and other forms of intimate partner violence. There was a strong correlation there as well, emphasising this idea that PABs may form part of a suite of abuse and are highly related to other forms of violence. So when we looked at the parents, when we asked them to report on their experiences, we see that this is not something that we can brush away and say happens in a very small amount of cases. And as researchers, we have to validate things empirically, but often the spark for these inquiries come from our knowledge in real life. And I know that every time I've spoken to people about this phenomenon, they have known someone, or they have been the person that has had this happen to them following a family breakdown. And this confirms those findings. And this paper has just been accepted in a very widely respected journal, Journal of Family Violence. It was just awaiting its final acceptance, after 2 revisions, that validates the empirical strength of these findings. Very, very importantly, though, is that we do also need to put those behaviours into context. Now, these have to be interpreted very, very carefully because of what I said before. So the way I applied Bennett's 5-factor model is that I went through systematically. So I first went through the sample and I said, okay, how many people are not having contact with their children? Okay, it was 22.7%. Out of those, how many of them had a previously good relationship? 16.3% of the total sample. Then, how many of those had not been abusive, accused, or found of abuse? 8.5% of the total sample. Then, how many of those had alienating behaviours present? 3.5%. And then finally, how many of those saw manifestations in the children? 2.9%. Now, there are 2 things to say about these results. The first is it's important to contextualise those percentages, because 2.9% of the children in separated families in England and Wales is still 1,300 children. So even if we apply the framework in this way, 2.9% sounds really small and might be mistaken for something rare, where in fact it's a number that is substantial and deserves our attention, which is at minimum 1,300 children per year. And the reason I say at minimum is because if you apply these factors in a different order, you get a different outcome. And I'll give you an example. If you apply factors 2, 3, and 4 alone, which is basically saying the person had a previously good relationship and they're not abusive and the alienating behaviors are present, but crucially, the contact refusal hasn't manifested yet, then you get a much higher percentage. So it's really important to say that just because the behaviors haven't manifested in the child, i.e. through contact, refusal, and them joining in, doesn't mean the behaviors aren't present, and it doesn't mean the behaviors aren't damaging, which is what factors 2, 3, and 4 would establish, is that you've got a good parent who is now being alienated against with those behaviors. And I've spoken with lots of parents who say they're frustrated because in order to present a case in court, they have to show the outcome. They have to show the child's refusing contact. Well, what if they're not? What if they're still spending time with them, but they know the behaviors are happening? Also, what if that contact refusal isn't on behalf of the child? What if the child has been taken away against their will? They don't actually know whether the contact refusal is manifesting or not. So we have to be very careful how we apply this model. And that's why a lot of researchers have chosen to focus on the behaviors rather than the outcome. We then conducted a second study, which was looking at how children experience these behaviors through the eyes of their now adult selves. And like I said, this study was funded by Good Egg Safety and involved a similar methodology. So we then took a cross-sectional survey of, again, over 1,000 young adults aged 18 to 25 living in the UK. And for this, we used a self-report PAB exposure measure, which is a new validated measure by Jennifer Harman and colleagues. And again, those measures of mental health around PTSD, depression, and suicidality. And we saw, again, a huge prevalence of adults remembering behaviors that are alienating. So when we coded on a 5-point scale, which was never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, when we coded sometimes, often, and always as yes, and the other two as no, we found that 98, nearly all of our sample, answered yes to at least one item. We also found that 25% answered yes to over 20 out of the 30 items, which is just an extraordinary level of prevalence within the sample. And that was very similar for mothers' alienating behaviours and fathers' alienating behaviours. Interestingly, men reported experiencing more alienating behaviours from their mothers and fathers than women did when they were children. So there's something there, and there was no other significant differences in PAB experiences. So maybe that indicates that this is maybe more of a boy issue when they're children. And in terms of the impact on mental health, there was a strong correlation between both mothers and fathers' PABs and adverse mental health outcomes such as PTSD, depression, and suicide ideation. Again, we don't know the direction of that relationship, but we know they're related, and that is a cause for concern. Again, these findings need to be taken with caution, because what we weren't able to do with these adults was ask them about the contextual factors, because they probably didn't know the contextual factors. So we weren't able to ask them, yes, but was the parent, these behaviors were about abusive, or did you have a previously good relationship with them? Because children often aren't privy to that additional context. So we didn't ask them those questions. We might do in a future study to see if we can get some kind of indication. So it may well be that actually, if we took into the example the context, there would be a much decreased percentage of children that were answering yes to these questions and were being alienated rather than protected. However, I would argue that when you're coming down from a near 100%, any manipulation that you could then make would still leave a sizable chunk. So whilst you have to take these findings with caution, this is still showing that the behaviours themselves are hugely prevalent. And whether the behaviours are being enacted for a protective reason or not, they're still hugely confusing and damaging for children. So it's really interesting to still know that these behaviours are so prevalent within the sample. So in terms of a discussion, my interpretation of these results is that PABs present a significant public health issue. If that relationship between PABs and mental health outcomes exists so strongly, we have to view this as a public health issue, as well as, for example, a legal and an educational one. And there were similarities with our findings and international findings, which underscores that kind of global nature of the problem. There is a clear need for legal and social interventions and recommendations for policy changes. And we'll talk about a specific piece of guidance in a minute. But it does fundamentally reiterate the widespread nature of these PABs and the severity of them. And we need more research in this area. Now, I want to talk about the recent Family Justice Council guidance very briefly, because I had a very mixed reaction to the guidance. I've written a blog on that, which you can find on my personal website, drbenhine.co.uk. But I wanted to touch upon it here. So in the first section, a couple of paragraphs I wanted to touch upon were relating to the first part of my presentation, which is I felt there was quite a gross misrepresentation of the state of the literature within these paragraphs. I've written to the FJC about this, and I would love the opportunity to speak with them, because I think what they have done here is they've not only conflated a few different terms. So you can see here parental alienation, alienating behaviours, parental alienation syndrome, and there's a lot of different concepts that have been delineated within the literature, that's not been reflected here. And the problem with that is that we see sentences: for the avoidance of doubt, the Family Justice Council recognises that parental alienation syndrome has no evidential basis and is considered a harmful pseudoscience. Concept of parental alienation syndrome and parental alienation are increasingly exploited within family litigation. Now, the problem with those sentences is that parental alienation syndrome has been substantially discredited within the literature. Parental alienation has not, and neither have alienating behaviours. So the idea that PA is something that is diagnosable and clinical is something that is still an ongoing debate, and there's a lot more difficulty around that than the behaviours themselves, and that nuance is not captured here, and that is misleading and damaging. You also have a bizarre situation where this statement is made, and then the Family Justice Council then talk about the fact that alienating behaviours can happen, and actually it's really important to administer guidance on them. So there's a bit of a disconnect there between what the guidance is saying is important and then what it's advising on. The second thing is to talk about A, the 3 elements that were provided to the court, and B, this paragraph, which actually references the research that I have just spoken about through dissemination of the report to certain key contacts ahead of this talk. They've obviously been submitted and I believe slightly misrepresented. So first of all, just to look at the 3 elements, you'll notice that these actually overlap massively with Burnett's 5-factor model. They've just framed it as 3. The issue here is that, as you can see, in order to a court to be satisfied that alienating behaviours had occurred, you have factor 1, or element 1, which is the child is reluctant, refusing, or resisting engagement in a relationship. Now, that is actually not alienating behaviour. That's whether you're establishing parental alienation. So this document is completely tangled up in terms of the technology that it's terminology, sorry, that it's choosing to use at any given point. Because in order to conclude that alienating behaviours had occurred, you actually only need 3, which is that the other parent has engaged in behaviours that have indirectly or directly impacted the child. So again, there's a lot of kind of teasing out that needs to be done when you're issuing guidance like this to say, are we talking about whether abuse is present, or are we talking about the impact, or are we talking about both? And I would argue that there are parents who are going to be in a situation where they face great difficulty presenting to the court that a parent is eroding that relationship with their child and is alienating them because it hasn't quite manifested in a reluctance or a resistance yet. And they're not going to get a finding that is ultimately going to lead to a worse outcome in the end, because once the reluctance or the resistance and refusal is occurring, the damage is already done. So there's a lot to say about point 10 within section 2. There's also a lot to say about this paragraph. It says research evidence suggests that alienating behaviours which actually impact on the child's relationship with the other parent are relatively rare. That statement is lacking a huge amount of nuance around these findings, because if you're talking about alienating behaviours point blank, whether they have an effect or not, they're actually hugely prevalent. They're not rare at all. When you're talking about impact on the child's relationship with the other parent, it all depends on how you're conceptualizing that. If that has to be through contact resistance and refusal, that's far too narrow, because that is basically saying you have to get to a point where it's the damage is done in order to make some kind of judgment or intervention. And I don't think we would put that with any other form of abuse. You wouldn't say to the court, well, I'm only going to see you once you've got a broken arm. You would intervene earlier. And so I think that statement is misleading and a misuse of this research, because what they are focusing on is the application of William Burnett's 5-factor model that says, okay, when all the factors are met in this application, yes, it's 2.9%. Even if we then roll with that, the use of rare is interesting there, because it's rare as a percentage, but not as a numerical figure when applied to the national statistics about the amount of children involved in court proceedings and family breakdown. So I've articulated that in a blog. I have made contact with the FJC, but if there is anyone on the call who has a more direct link in, please let me know, because I'm more than happy to talk to you about it and talk to them about it more directly, because I think there's a lot to do with this document, because I am actually very pleased that the document exists, because at least it's taking a clear stance and an interest on the topic and acknowledging that alienating behaviours occur. I think we just need to keep the conversation going and refine it. So in conclusion, and I said I wanted to make sure there was lots of time for questions, which hopefully we will have, is that parental alienation and alienating behaviours are real and are robustly scientifically supported. That's a fact. They are also a widespread problem, and this is now evidenced in the UK with these reports. But there are still significant issues with how, for example, how claims are brought and how they're handled in court, as shown by the guidance. And more research and transparency is definitely necessary without the unhelpful gendered narratives and blanket denial of the phenomenon. These are the 2 reports. They are available right now online. There is a QR code here, which is going to be on the last slide as well, if you want to go and see them and download them. Please share them. They're now out in the public domain. This is our launch event, so please share them with whoever you think needs to see them, and I will be doing the same. I just want to fully and further acknowledge the Hanley Stewart Trust and Good Egg Safety for funding these projects, because there is a lot of, in some cases, unnecessary controversy around this topic. It is hard to get funding to investigate this, and I actually think through this small amount of funding, we've actually generated some hugely impactful research that's going to shape the way we think about this. These are all the other ways to kind of contact me and follow my work, and I'll leave the QR code up as well to for the report, so that people can access those. I've said that and I've just stopped sharing, so let me just put the last slide back up so that it's there. That's everything I have to say for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop the recording so that it's a kind of select piece that I can upload, and then we'll get into the Q&A.